Hello everyone, peace be upon you. Before we begin, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe, and stay with me until the end of the story. Also, leave a comment telling me which city and country you're watching from. I'd love to see how far my story has reached. For those of you who have already subscribed, I sincerely wish you good health, ease in all your affairs, abundant blessings, and may all your hopes and dreams come true. Amen. Now, let's begin the story. The wind off Bighorn Mountain cut through canvas and bone, the kind that turns breath into grit and makes steel feel colder than ice. The outpost sat on a ledge of Wyoming rock, a scatter of tents, antennas, and a mud-brown Humvee crushed with frost. Inside the command tent, a satellite still image glowed pale on a plastic table. The target was a figure framed by timber and corrugated roof, far down in a valley crossed by ranch roads and dry creek beds. Distance readout, just under 3 kilometers. Window of exposure, 3 to 5 seconds at most. Crosswind, unstable, irregular shears. Captain Daniel Hayes stood with his sleeves pushed past the elbow, jaw tight. He didn't talk much when the wind sounded like that. Beside him, Cole Whitman scrolled telemetry that kept stuttering, then dying. Drones can't hold a path. Gusts are flipping them, Whitman said. Jason Langley was on a spotting scope with a glove over his cheek to keep the mount from freezing his skin. I can't even pick a shadow, he muttered. On a crate near the flap, Marcus Reed stripped a bolt and re-greased it like he was daring the cold to slow him down. 3 clicks in this soup. Reed said. That's not a shot. That's a prayer. No one answered. Hayes flipped the manila folder that had shown up an hour earlier on a rotary wing drop. The tab didn't list rank. Just a name handwritten in block letters, Evelyn Monroe. One blurred training photo. No citation, no unit history, no ribbons, nothing. He looked up when the Humvee outside coughed, then idled. She stepped out without a word, tall and lean under a sand-colored shell, goggles hiding her eyes, scarf covering half her face. No ruck. Just a hard rifle case in one hand and a small, weathered logbook in the other. She reached the tent, let the canvas fall behind her, and met Hayes with a short nod. Monroe? He asked. Eve, she said. You read the board? I did. Doable? Her glove thumbed open the logbook. Lines of wind notes, quick sketches of ridges, short arrows, numbers stacked like a rhythm instead of math. Shots aren't impossible, she said, voice low. Just not mapped yet. Reed watched her put the rifle together on the floor. The stock looked custom, sanded smooth where the cheek rests. The scope had a lens cut he didn't recognize. The firing pin, slightly discolored like it had been hand-fitted. No digital weather meter. No laser rangefinder on the rail. You running without spotter? Reed asked. I want silence, Eve said. Hayes gave a small nod. Let her work. Outside, the wind came in teeth. Eve walked to the lip of the overlook and didn't hunch or brace. She just stood. She pulled a few short threads from the fray of her scarf and let them go. They hung, danced, curled, then sank. She tracked them with nothing but her eyes. No watch glance. No app. Back on the line she dropped to prone, folded into the rifle, and set her cheek to the wood like it was a steadying hand. Breath went out. Didn't come back for a long beat. Langley called intermittent movement in the structure. Maybe a shoulder. Maybe a curtain. I can't tell. Whitman swore under his breath at a telemetry crash. Reed sat on his haunches, arms crossed, pretending he wasn't watching her, then watching anyway. Hayes checked his time. The valley light shifted as clouds tore past. Minutes stacked into 20. The target showed as a flicker. Eve didn't fire. Another 20 minutes crawled. She adjusted the elevation drum by notches Reed couldn't track. No math spoken. Just feel. Hayes noticed the one thing that was never random, her breathing. Slow, measured, the kind of pace that makes time stretch. Window, Langley hissed. 3 seconds, 2, gone. Reed leaned in, disappointed and wired. She froze. Hayes didn't look away from Eve. She waited. An hour later, the wind slid east to west in a new pitch. It was small, a different scrape on the tent, a new sting on exposed skin, but it was there. Eve's left hand made a minor correction. Nothing showy. She didn't lift her head. She didn't scan for approval. The rifle's action cycled with a soft mechanical kiss, barely a sound against the constant moan of weather. No muzzle jump. No dust flick. Just a tiny click like a careful door. Silence stood upright with them for a full half-minute until the radio cracked alive. A distant observer, voice clipped by the cold, impact confirmed. Target down. Langley pulled off the scope like it had burned him. Reed stared. Whitman's monitor rebooted to a blue screen he ignored. Eve eased up from the stock, slung the rifle, and stood. No victory look. No breathy laugh. Just a small nod to Hayes like a task finished in a list. In the mess tent, heat lamps hummed and did nothing. Word ran faster than the wind. 3 kilometers in a sheer field without a spotter and no signature. Reed rubbed his face with both hands. I didn't even see a flash, he said. Langley shook his head, as if that would clear the math. Whitman flipped through his logs and found nothing that explained the curve. Hayes brought a metal mug to Eve where she sat alone near the flap. She didn't drink. She was listening. You could tell by the way her shoulders matched the tempo of the gusts. They'll ask for a debrief, he said. Keep it clean, she said. Keep it quiet. He crouched. Where'd you learn to hear wind like that? She closed the logbook with 2 fingers. Texas, she said. Long fields. Long waits. Hayes let that settle. Outside, the ridge scraped another wave of air and the antenna ticked. He looked around at his team, one skeptical, one raw-nerved, one buried in dead data, and he understood what the outpost had just been given. Not a miracle. A method none of them knew yet. By night, the generators thumped and the cold sharpened. Reed finally sat down across from Eve and didn't bother with bravado. You're running old school, he said. Feels like witchcraft. It's timing, she said. Everything else is noise. Langley listened from the stove, pretending to adjust the flame. Whitman traced wind arrows on a notepad and found the lines going in circles. Hayes stepped back into the tent with a new folder, edges wet from snow. He set it down. The cover read, Secondary Objective. Tomorrow gets harder, Hayes said. Eve didn't need to open it. She already had the wind in her head, and the valley was still talking. By gray first light the outpost was running on habit, gloves tugged, straps checked, batteries warmed under armpits to keep them alive. Hayes laid the secondary file on the table and traced the sat frames with 2 fingers. New target, same valley, nastier pattern, movement only between 2 shacks, a 10-foot crossing shielded from above, exposure 3 to 4 seconds, armor assumed. Langley glassed the gap until his eyelashes froze together. He pops and vanishes, he said. Whitman fought with a drone that crabbed sideways every time a gust pressed its belly. Reed stared at the ridgeline like it owed him answers. Vaughn came over the radio with the clipped tone of a man pushing a timeline. We confirmed the successor. Window irregular. You have 1 chance each hour. Keep signature 0. Eve didn't wait for a pep talk. She walked the ridge in short lines, tying cloth strips to willows, reading how they twisted. Back prone, she folded into the rifle the same way as yesterday, cheek to stock, breath thin and even. The air felt wrong at first light, too much chop spinning off the cut in the rock, little eddies that would shoulder a bullet mid-flight. She did nothing. The first hour slid by. The gap flashed open. The figure crossed. Reed's heart kicked. Langley hissed, "Now." Eve didn't fire. The opening closed like a door. Reed's jaw worked. Hayes didn't speak. Second hour, same dance. The target crossed again, faster now. She didn't fire. Langley looked like he might come out of his skin. That was clean. Eve didn't lift her head. "No," she said. It dipped. He blinked back at the silent air, as if the wind owed him proof. Reed muttered, "We're burning daylight, but not with the old edge." It sounded more like he was testing her boundary. While the outpost simmered, the story inside Eve walked backward. A Texas pasture, fence posts silvered by sun. Thomas sat her in the grass at 6 years old and taught her to find stillness before she ever learned to touch a trigger. He'd lift a palm to hush the world and wait for a hush to answer. Coyotes far out. Crickets. A slack flag line. "Don't ask the shot to behave," he'd say. "Ask the wind what it wants. If it won't speak, you don't shoot." She grew into that rhythm. By high school she could put a round through a bottle cap on a fence post by listening to how wheat leaned. At Fort Bragg, instructors called her a metronome. No drama, no rush, scores that made people superstitious. She ignored applause and kept a pencil map of wind in a notebook no one could read. Back in Wyoming, Whitman finally got a drone up along a diagonal and watched it skate sideways like a leaf. He cursed the turbulence and killed the feed. The third hour came. The gap opened. Hayes leaned toward the scope out of instinct. Eve's breathing stretched, then went shallow. Not yet. A gust stuttered, died half a heartbeat, then turned along the long axis of the valley. She felt it as a cool brush on her temple and a small change in the way the scarf tugged at her jaw. She rolled one click into elevation, a hair of windage, and let the rifle settle into bone. No drama, no show. A small, mechanical breath from the trigger. Nothing else. They held nothing together for 30 long seconds until Whitman's secondary handset crackled. HQ confirms. Target neutralized in the open. Single impact. No audio signature. Langley fell back on his heels. Reed stared across the gap and finally barked a short laugh that had no humor in it. "You waded him into it," he said. She didn't answer. She just wrote a short loop in her logbook, 2 arcs, a small dot where the gust had died. The mess tent felt different at noon. Nobody said miracle now. They said her name and left space around it. Hayes set down a tray and didn't touch the coffee. "They're gonna put this on a board somewhere," he said. "Your timing. Your hold-offs." Eve closed the book. "Then they'll try to teach what can't be taught." Vaughn pushed in again, less bark this time, more curiosity leaking through rank. "Command will want a methods brief," he said. "What are you running?" Hayes glanced at Eve. She kept her eyes on the tent seam that tapped like a metronome. "Small corrections," she said. "Long timing." Vaughn was quiet for a beat. "Copy." The line clicked dead. Afternoon brought a lull that wasn't rest. Reed sat outside with a rag and a bolt and watched the sky move. Langley scribbled his own fake wind map and scratched it out, frustrated that his arrows chased themselves. Whitman dragged a chair to the edge of the canvas and let the cold bite his ears while he listened to the different pitches of air on guy lines. Hayes did the admin thing and pretended not to look at the ridge where Eve had gone. When she came back her cheeks were ruddy, not from strain but from the honesty of weather. She set the logbook down open. Reed scanned it and shook his head. The marks looked like music more than math. Night cooled the steel into a darker silence. Somewhere in that dim the past slid in again, Thomas stepping behind her, thumb and forefinger lightly pinching her shoulder blades to set posture, whispering that the shot wasn't an act of force but a decision about time. Fort Bragg's tower, rain blowing sideways, her finger still because the gust hadn't finished speaking. Instructors thought it was nerves. It wasn't. It was courtesy. Morning would bring the third card on the table. Whitman joked to break his own tension, called it a superstition to count. Hayes didn't laugh. He unrolled a new map, urban glass, water feature, tight security lanes, camera blind spots, marching time blocks. The kind of layout that makes shooters itch and commanders sweat. He didn't sell it. He just put it between them. We rotate out in 72, he said quietly. We either hand this off or we commit. Eve touched the corner of the print like she was feeling temperature. The plaza angles, the tower faces, the gap where light would punch a hole in surveillance at a certain minute if the sky held. She didn't say yes. She didn't say no. She watched the wind toy with the canvas door and listened for what the valley would say about a city she hadn't seen yet. When dawn bled into the snow again, Reed found a pin in his pocket he didn't remember carrying, the team crest he'd meant to give to rookies with beers and loud noise. He set it on a crate near her logbook and didn't make a speech. Langley poured coffee and missed his cup, hands still learning to be steady after long hours of almost shots. Whitman pulled a list of parts he wanted and tore it up, because parts weren't the thing. Hayes stepped into the doorway and let the cold air wash the heat from his neck. He felt the weight of a call he should make and the authority to make it. He lifted the secondary folder, the one marked for urban, glanced once at Eve, and understood that this wasn't just about range tables or heroics. It was about whether the team would learn to hear the same quiet or keep talking over it. He set the folder down in front of her. We commit, he said. Eve didn't smile. She drew a small square on an empty page and traced a beam of light across it with the tip of her pencil, as if she were already inside the city, already standing in the wind that would pretend there was no place for silence. She kept tracing that line until it intersected a fountain she'd never seen and a camera cone she'd already memorized. Hayes watched without interrupting. Urban rules are different, he said. Crowds, glass, drones, guard rotations, mics everywhere. Eve nodded once, like the variables were just another weather front rolling in. Vaughn came over the net with a weight that said politics. Target schedules a plaza walk around noon 3 days a week. Coverage is layered, state, private, media. We need a hit with zero signature. If you can't guarantee that, we don't greenlight. Hayes let the silence sit. Reed rubbed a thumb along the edge of his cup and finally said what everyone else was thinking. That isn't a shot. That's a vanishing act. Eve closed the notebook. Then the act has to start before we arrive. They pushed off the ridge before dark, a short hop to a flatland strip, then a ride north to Anchorage where a safe house waited like a cabin pretending not to listen. Whitman laid out kit on a pine table, optics, comms pucks, a suppressor request form that looked like red tape and prayer. Langley practiced moving with a toolbox instead of a rifle bag, shoulders learning civilian sway instead of patrol angles. Reed stared at a city map until the streets became veins, then he stared at Eve and realized she wasn't looking at streets at all. She was watching wind forecasts and sun angles. Glass turns to mirrors at noon, she said. Cameras blink when a reflection blinds them. Drones adjust altitude to clear glare. That's the window. Hayes fought the urge to overplan. He'd led enough raids to know when detail became noise. We do this like yesterday, he told the room. Long timing, small corrections. Reed smirked. City isn't a mountain. Eve didn't rise. Wind doesn't care about zip codes. Night rolled in quiet. Somewhere below the snowline the ocean pushed its breath up the inlet, and the cabin frame ticked like a slow clock. Eve sat by the window with her logbook open to a blank page, listening for a city she'd never lived in. Thomas's voice came back as if he were in the next room, "Don't hurry the air. Ask it. If it doesn't answer, let it keep it secret." She wrote 2 words in the margin, "Hold off," then crossed them out. This wasn't about refusal. It was about timing down to the half-second. The next day they flew south in pieces, not together, not memorable. Eve wore an orange construction vest and safety goggles that changed her posture more than her face. Langley carried a coil of cable and looked at his shoes like a tired apprentice. Reed rode a service elevator with a mop bucket he didn't need. Hayes walked 2 blocks behind like a man late for a meeting. Whitman slid into a utility closet across from the plaza with a laptop that would never touch a public network. Vaughn's last message came as they crossed into the grid: no collateral, no panic, no trace. Seattle's plaza was all hard edges softened by people, tour groups, office smoke breaks, kids throwing bread at birds that didn't want bread. Eve stood in the shade of a half-leased office tower and let the wind off the water tell her where it wanted to go between glass canyons. Up high, flags snapped, then sagged, then fluttered like small arguments. She climbed to the 30th floor of a space still smelling of paint and drywall dust. A conference room wrapped in unfinished glass gave her the one thing she needed, a through line from light to target to noise. "Test it," Hayes said on the whisper mic. She didn't fire. She released a pinch of chalk dust into a shaft of sun and watched it swirl, lift, and thin. She timed how long the glare blinded the opposite camera: 1, 2, 3, and when the camera recovered, 4. She exhaled. 3 seconds hard, 1 soft, she said. "We shoot in the hard." Reed paced, restless. "Armor?" Whitman answered without looking up. "Soft vest, maybe plate. Neck's open when he waves." Langley swallowed. That's when everyone's looking at him. Eve adjusted a bipod that wasn't there, then didn't use one. She rested bone on concrete, cheek on stock, and let gravity do the engineering. The suppressor threaded on with a patient twist. No hero speeches. No luck charms. Just the metronome of her breath. Afternoon dress rehearsals tightened the plan. They learned drone reposition times when glare hit, the tour guide pause that always landed a minute before noon, the way the fountain plume rose and fell like a pulse. Hayes marked routes in and out that dissolved into normal foot traffic. Reed ran what-ifs until what-if ran out of steam. Langley stopped asking for perfect and started asking for quiet. By dusk they were ghosts of maintenance, leaving with the same tools they'd brought, nothing extra, nothing shiny. Back at a small room above a bakery, Hayes asked the only question that mattered. "We green?" Eve watched the last light throw a blade across the wall and nodded once. "If the sky stays clear," she said, "the city will blink at 12:08. When it does, we're already done." Reed didn't believe in fate, but he believed in tells. He watched her close the book and slip it under her vest like it was more fragile than the rifle. Whitman set alarms he wouldn't need. Langley checked his hands and found they weren't shaking. Vaughn sent one line at midnight: "Mission authority is yours." Morning would bring noise, sirens in the distance, buses braking, shoes on stone. Morning would bring a man who thought crowds were shields. Morning would bring light bouncing off glass like a signal only one person in the city could hear. Eve lay down on a bare floor and let the building hum settle into her bones. When she closed her eyes she wasn't sleeping. She was listening for the second the city would forget to watch itself. At 10:40 the plaza woke into patterns they'd already clocked: tour flags rising, security pacing the same 12 steps, drones nudging their altitude to avoid glare. Hayes moved through the crowd like a commuter who hated being late. Reed took a lazy post by a newspaper box that hadn't held papers in years. Langley leaned against a planter with a rolled blueprint he'd stolen from a job site dumpster. Whitman was a voice in the wire, heartbeat steady, windows mapped in his head. Eve climbed the unfinished stairwell again, ignoring the elevator that creaked and lied. 30 floors up, the conference room smelled like gypsum and cold glass. She laid the rifle down without ceremony and set her cheek to the stock. The scope ate the plaza into clean shapes: a fountain plume like a white thread, a row of umbrellas, a bank of cameras in black domes, the corridor where the convoy would nose in and try to look casual. She unrolled a small strip of tape and marked the glass edge: her own zero that had nothing to do with numbers. Status, Hayes breathed. Light building, Whitman said. We're on schedule. Drone glare test in 1 minute. Eve pinched a chalk packet and cut it open with her teeth. A soft cloud drifted and bent, caught by a seam in the window frame, then drifted straight again. Thermals are rising, she said. Minor. We shoot before they start to dance. Reed's voice came low. Perimeter sweep moving slow. He's milking it. Let him, Hayes said. Let him think crowd equals cover. At 11:52 the plaza hit that odd quiet they'd timed the day before, when tour scripts took a breath and the food carts hit midday lull. A jogger tied a shoe exactly where he'd tied it yesterday. A security guy squinted into the glass and saw only himself. The wind off the water found a lane between towers and whispered along Eve's jawline. She moved the windage drum a fraction until the rifle felt like it had settled into bone instead of hands. Convoy inbound, Whitman said. 2 lead, 1 principal, 1 tail. Seat layout matches. Eve didn't answer. Her lungs found a long slope down and held near empty. The first SUV slid into view and staged the choreography, hard stop, doors crack, bodies fill space with nothing but presence. The principal stepped out shielded by a half-arc of men who believed in lines and eyes and weight. He waved, because men like him always waved. The sun threw a blade across the plaza at 12:08, right on time. It hit the tower opposite, skipped to the fountain, and kicked into the camera dome. The red record dot blinked blind, 1, 2, 3. The drone in the upper lane hopped a meter to chase the signal it lost. Hard 3, Eve whispered. Take it now. She didn't yank. She didn't twitch. She pressed until the trigger broke the way a thin icicle gives under a fingertip. No flash. No dust. Just the tiny internal click of a machine doing what it was built to do. For a heartbeat nothing changed. Then the principal's head tipped as if listening to a private joke. Knees softened. Arms went slack. He folded toward the fountain with no drama, no spray, no theatrical mess. The guard to his left grabbed air. The one to his right looked up too late. The crowd's noise dipped into a confused hush before it learned how to scream. Impact confirmed, Whitman said, voice flat. No audio. No echo. Cameras blind. We're clean. Walk, Hayes said. He didn't run. He didn't look back. Reed turned the corner and vanished into a coffee line. Langley closed his blueprint and became a man late for a contractor meeting. The tail SUV lurched, then stopped, then tried to decide what protocol fit a death that didn't make a sound. Eve broke the rifle in 4 moves she could have done with her eyes closed. Barrel into the case that didn't look like a case. Bolt into a canvas roll that said, leveling tool. Scope into a padded pouch labeled, laser measure, in a font nobody reads. She peeled the tape from the glass and rubbed the chalk with her thumb until the pain looked like it had never met her. She walked the stairwell because elevators remember faces. On the street, the city had started to raise its voice. Sirens complained. Radios scratched. A teenage kid filmed nothing useful and narrated like a pro. Eve stepped into the slipstream of a group tour and borrowed their pace. Whitman counted intersections. Left at the florist. Right at the loading dock. Garbage truck timing in 10. You're ahead of it. Copy, Hayes said for them all, but it was really for her. She dropped the vest into a contractor tote, swapped goggles for plain glasses, and became someone whose job was to argue about floor drains. They regrouped in pieces, not as a team. Hayes inside the bakery stairwell, Reed under the smell of yeast and coffee, Langley upstairs pretending to study a fire escape plan. Eve closed the door behind her and let the quiet in the hall sit like a reward you don't brag about. Whitman cleared the net. Media is nowhere. Security says medical emergency. Cameras show a glare and nothing else. We're ghosts. Reed sat down hard and laughed once, a dry sound emptied of swagger. That wasn't a shot, he said. That was a disappearance. Hayes didn't smile. He looked at Eve. We're done. She nodded and pulled the logbook. In the margin she drew a short line, the beam, and a tiny circle, the blind. No number, no flourish. Just a record that made sense to one person. They split routes out of the district the way rain finds different gutters. Vaughn came on late, words measured. Package confirms neutral. Status undetected. Stand by for transport. Reed muttered, transport can wait. City needs to forget faster. Hayes told him to breathe. That night the safe room felt bigger without saying why. Langley finally poured coffee into the cup instead of onto the counter. Whitman picked a splinter out of his finger and looked pleased about pain that made sense. Hayes set his radio on the table and didn't pick it up for a long time. Eve sat by the window, logbook open to a page that looked like a weather map and a music sheet had learned to share paper. He approached without the rank voice. They'll try to recreate it. They shouldn't, she said. They'll chase noise. Tell me how you judged the dip. She tapped the corner of the page where a single arrow cut through 3 tiny circles. The drone altitude hop. It's slow by a half beat when glare hits. That half beat leaves a pocket. He let that settle. Pocket big enough to hide a bullet. Big enough to hide a decision, she said. The room held that for a while. Reed dozed with his hands in his sleeves like a tired brawler. Langley finally stopped watching his own hands. Whitman wrote a line of code he'd never run, just to get the movement out of his head. Hayes stared at the ceiling until his eyes burned, then looked back at Eve and saw she wasn't tired. She was empty in the good way, work finished, no leftover noise. Vaughn's message broke the quiet with a heavier weight. Next tasking inbound. High-risk infrastructure. Weather extreme. Sabotage indicators credible. You'll have 90 minutes of comms blackout during peak event. Advise. Hayes read it twice and then a third time for the part nobody says out loud. Storm, he said. Gulf, Whitman added, already thinking in wind speeds and wave heights. Reed rubbed his face and grinned without humor. From glass canyons to steel legs in open water. Eve turned a page and drew a tall rectangle with cross-bracing, an oil rig sketched in 4 strokes. She marked the wind spiral around it with a loose coil and the exhaust stacks with small squares. Then she put a dot where a man with a bag would stand if he were paid to make something disappear. Hayes didn't dress it up. We go, he said. Eve closed the book and listened to a different kind of air, the kind that comes off warm water and turns mean when it remembers it can. The city outside went back to mistaking noise for safety. She tied her hair tighter and let her shoulders square to a storm she hadn't met yet. 2 flights and a chopper hop later, the Gulf spread out like dark metal under a sky already stacking bands of cloud. The rig rose from the water on 4 legs with cross-bracing and rust scars, cranes angled like elbows, flare stacks breathing low. Eve came aboard under a false job code with a coil of cable and a badge that said maintenance, which is another way to say invisible when weather is coming. Hayes kept the team lean. Reed moved cargo with a deckhand slouch. Langley learned to carry a tool bucket and not look at cameras. Whitman checked into a shoreside ops room and fed them weather and silence in equal measure. Vaughn sent the last clear line before the bands hit, blackout expected during the eye wall. Expect spoofed crew and false work orders. The real crew spun down and lifted off by afternoon. Storm protocol. Tie everything. Bleed pressure. Kill heat that could become fire. When the last chopper thumped away, the rig changed timber, a hollow thunk in its bones as wind started to lean into it for real. Eve walked the corridors once, counting corners, feeling air push and pull through gaps. She picked a spot not in the obvious places. Not the platform edge. Not the top catwalk. She chose a narrow service channel behind the exhaust tower where the wind had to thread itself like a rope. She ran a palm along the bulkhead and felt the vibration of the storm in her bones like a slow, rising drum. The false team arrived when the rain made every surface shine. They wore the wrong kind of calm. They moved in twos with a bag that never left a hand. They scanned, not for safety, but for eyes. They avoided camera cones they shouldn't have known. Eve tracked them by sound more than sight, the way a Bouthiel taps a bolt head, the wrong cadence when a man is trying not to be a man. She chambered around and laid the rifle across a low brace. No bipod. Steel and bone made the platform. The wind came heavy right to left, 50, then 60, gusting harder. She tested a breath and felt it shear off her teeth. That breath told her the bullet would want to skate. Hayes sat 2 decks down with a radio that would soon be worthless. Reed posted near a valve tree with a rag and a wrench, eyes soft, mind hard. Langley checked a panel he didn't understand, then left it a little more secure than he found it. Whitman fed the last live radar before the screen became gray and then nothing. Bands stacking. Pressure falling. You'll get a lull near the eye. Use it, he said, then static took his place. The first man from the false team knelt at a junction box and pulled out cutters that looked too clean. The wind hit a new note against the tower, a low moan under the rain rattle. Eve waited. She didn't force a window that wasn't open. The gusts came like hands, pushing, slapping, then letting go. She let them pass. The rig groaned and shifted. A cable slammed a stanchion and sang. The man opened the box. She didn't shoot. The second man covered, turning his face out of the weather, a reflex that swung his neck into clear line for half a heartbeat. She didn't take that either. Timing is a courtesy. You wait until the wind stops talking over you. When the eye edge brushed them, everything changed. Rain went thin. Sound opened like a door. The wind that had been a shove became a steady pull along the service lane, clean, laminar, predictable for a breath you could count. Eve rolled a half click into elevation, took out the hold she'd been nursing, and pressed the trigger until it broke. No echo. The wind swallowed it. The first man's chin dipped like he'd suddenly remembered to nod, then he folded sideways and didn't get up. The second turned into what he thought was cover and gave her profile instead. She had already cycled. The second press fell into the same pocket as if the air had set a track. He pitched against a valve and let out one small sound, lost under the tower's hum. The third man didn't try to be brave. He reached for the bag and failed twice because hands don't work right when the world gets too quiet too fast. He ran for the helideck. She watched him go and didn't take the long, messy shot through water, rail, and panic. Sometimes the right thing is to let fear do the job you don't need to do. She listened instead. No shouts. No alarm. The rig systems kept breathing on the low side, like a sleeper under a heavy blanket. She broke the rifle down to travel mode and wiped the film of salt off the action with the corner of her scarf. Hayes reached her path and didn't ask if it was done. He knew by the way the noise had resumed its normal pattern in his head. Reed slid into the compressor bay and took a slow count around the bodies. He didn't look long. He moved the bag into a dry box and locked the hasp without comment. Langley checked a gauge he understood this time and nodded to himself because the number didn't change. The storm's back half hit harder, as it always does, and threw rain like hands full of nails. They sat it out in the shadow of the tower, not talking, because talking would have been disrespect in a place where the wind was already speaking loud enough. When the bands finally dragged their weight past and the light came thin and exhausted, the rig sounded like a ship after a fight, everything in place but changed. Whitman's voice found them again, tinny, like it had come through old wire. Sensors show no thermal spikes. No pressure anomalies. Looks clean. Vaughn followed with a line that felt less like an order and more like a witness. Threat indicators dropped to 0. Report at discretion. Eve walked the deck once more, not to admire it, just to confirm what she already knew. No sign of entry except scuffs that would read like storm. No shots heard. No brass. No marks on glass. Nothing for anyone to find when they came back with checklists and opinions. Reed leaned on the rail and let the wind dry his face. "You rode the storm's shoulder," he said. It wasn't a compliment. It was a diagnosis. Langley looked out where the horizon should have been and saw only gray. "I thought the wind would be the enemy," he said. "It's the track." Back on shore, the debrief had fewer questions than the city. People understand storms. They call damage weather and thank insurance. Hayes handed in a summary that was mostly times and numbers. Vaughn read it and didn't ask for flair. He added one sentence to a file he didn't title: "Asset engaged during peak shear, used environmental pocket to mask action, zero collateral." Whitman sent a package of sensor data that would sit on a server until someone with clearance wanted to study a curve they couldn't teach. They slept in turns at a motel that smelled like bleach and coffee. Reed snored like a man who finally trusted the floor. Langley wrote down what he thought he'd learned and crossed out the parts that sounded like luck. Hayes stood outside under a buzzing sign and let the humidity soak his shirt until he stopped thinking about rank and started thinking about rest. Eve sat on the edge of a bed with the logbook open and drew a spiral with a dot in the comm center, then closed the cover and put it under her pillow out of habit more than need. Morning brought the kind of quiet that feels like a debt paid. Vaughn's next message didn't push. It asked. Optional transfer. Optional leave. Optional anything. Hayes looked at Eve and saw that options didn't move her. She wasn't chasing the next thing. She was waiting for the next silence. He asked what he always asked when the page felt blank. What now? She tied her hair again and looked at the window where a thin curtain tried to be a wall against bright heat. North, she said, not as an order and not as an answer. It was a direction people choose when they want space to hear. They drove until road became air and air became snow and the safe house above Anchorage recognized their boots. The team unpacked in a rhythm that didn't need a schedule. Reed set a pin on the shelf and didn't explain it. Langley got a fire to catch on the second try and grinned like he'd shot something. Whitman laid out equipment he wouldn't open that week. Hayes poured coffee into a chipped mug and let it sit until it was lukewarm, because warmth wasn't the point. Outside, trees held frost the way old men hold their breath before telling something honest. Inside, Eve opened the book and didn't write. Some pages are better blank. The work wasn't the shots. The work was the wait. Far away, people who liked boards and briefings tried to decide what to call what they had seen. Some said doctrine. Some said myth. Most said the word quiet like it was a tool they'd forgotten they owned. The rig sailed back into routine. The plaza went back to selfies. The mountain outpost, small, stubborn, cold, waited under the same wind, unchanged and always changing. Hayes looked at his team and knew the arc had bent and didn't need applause to prove it. They didn't toast. They didn't frame anything. They didn't say the line about lessons learned. But the lesson sat with them anyway: force makes noise, timing doesn't. In that cabin, with the stove ticking and the world finally out of their ears, Eve closed her eyes and listened again. Not for orders. Not for praise. For the same thing that had always told her when to act and when to let go. When the wind finished talking, she would move. Until then, the best work was to be still. The stove ticked like a slow clock and the snow held to the pines in sheets. Hayes let the cabin breathe without crowding it with plans. Reed took the pin back off the shelf, turned it once like a coin, then set it down again without comment. Langley practiced being quiet on purpose. Whitman closed his laptop and listened to nothing as if it were data. Eve sat near the small window with the logbook closed, thread of hair tucked behind one ear, hands empty. Still wasn't laziness here, it was work with the volume turned down. The first call came 3 days later, Vaughn asking for options instead of giving orders. "Multiple agencies want a readout," he said. "They'll ask you to teach what you do." Hayes looked at Eve. She didn't look back, she watched the snow shift on a branch and waited for it to fall by itself. "We can brief outcomes," Hayes said. "Not methods." Vaughn didn't argue. People in rooms like his know when they've been handed a boundary. In town, the grocery line had a paper about the Plaza medical incident, a column of words that stacked into nothing. On a back page, a map of the Gulf showed a storm track that bent and faded. Nobody cared about an oil rig that didn't blow. That was the point. Success, quiet enough to sound like routine, never trends. The team ate soup and didn't talk tactics over it. Reed admitted he slept. Langley admitted his hands were steady. Whitman admitted he liked the sound of ice settling on the eaves. At night the past still walked in and sat down like family. Dallas, fence posts, Thomas's voice teaching a child to outweight wind instead of outmuscle it. Fort Bragg's tower with sideways rain and a young instructor telling her to hurry up. She hadn't hurried then, she wouldn't now. People confuse patience with passivity. She knew different. Waiting is a position. You hold it. Hayes drove out alone one morning, chains whispering on the road, until the wide open stepped forward again, bighorns kind of sky, empty and not. The outpost was a place made of weather as much as wood. He parked where the ledge starts and stood in the same wind that once carried a shot across too much space. He wasn't measuring distance. He was measuring change, a team that argued less, a captain who asked fewer questions and better ones, a habit of letting silence answer first. He left nothing there. You don't build shrines to work done right. Back at the cabin, Vaughn arrived in person because some conversations don't belong on radios. He wore the kind of coat men in DC think will make them belong in weather. He warmed his hands on a mug and went straight to the point. There's talk about a unit, doctrine, a school with your name hidden inside it. Reed held his tongue. Langley studied the floor. Whitman controlled his eyebrows. Eve didn't reach for her book. You can make a school, she said. But you can't give them my ears. Vaughn nodded slowly. It wasn't defiance, it was fact. Then give me what you will, he said. Hayes leaned on the counter and gave him this. We teach timing. We teach restraint. We teach when not to shoot. Vaughn smiled without warmth. That won't sell, he said. It will work, Hayes said back. The conversation ended there, where it should. They flew east once, no cameras, no handshake line, down a hallway under the Pentagon where paint smells like policy. A room of officers and analysts sat straight and asked clean questions. Hayes walked them through outcomes and windows, not mystique. Whitman showed patterns that weren't math so much as rhythm. Reed said little, which said a lot. Langley talked about how a man who stops shaking can spot more. Eve said almost nothing, but when one colonel asked what she listens for, she gave him the only answer that mattered. When the noise stops pretending it's signal, she said. He wrote it down like a formula and would later learn it wasn't one. On the way out, a small display case in a forgotten corridor held a blank notebook under glass, a prop for a program nobody finished funding. Langley stared at it and then at the logbook under Eve's arm. You ever going to let them make a copy? He asked. They could copy paper, she said. They can't copy wind. He laughed once, softly. Fair. Word traveled like wind does, crooked paths, different speeds. In a base gym, someone told a story about a shot with no sound. In a bar near a pier, a deckhand told another about a storm that changed its mind. In an office, a slide deck called it signature minimized precision. The farther the story went, the louder it got. The truth stayed small and kept its shape. Spring scratched at the edge of the calendar. Snow softened into wet. Pine shed its weight. Hayes sat on the steps with a mug that had given up on being hot and let himself consider future tense. You could stay, he told Eve. Teach, even if you won't call it that. Build a team that won't need you. She didn't nod. She didn't disagree. She looked north like people do when the map is mostly blank above them. Staying is also a move, she said. But it has to be on purpose. Purpose didn't come as a mission file this time. It came as a quiet call from an old ranch hand near Dallas, a friend of Thomas who still kept an eye on the fence lines where coyotes trot their routes at dusk. Nothing urgent. Just a voice that wanted to say a name out loud and mean it. She went for a week and didn't take a rifle. She fixed a gate, oiled a hinge, and lay in the grass where she had learned to listen. At night she opened the logbook and didn't draw angles. She drew a face she hadn't seen in years with 2 lines and a curve that knew exactly where to stop. On the last evening the wind threaded the fence wire and hummed. She smiled without showing teeth and understood that some lessons never get old because the teacher is the same. When she came back, the cabin felt smaller in the way rooms do after you've stretched. Hayes saw it and didn't ask for an explanation. You moving? He said. She set the logbook down, touched the spine. Anchor to anchor, she said. Not a goodbye. Reed stood, shook her hand the way men do when they mean respect and don't want a speech. Langley hugged like a kid who had learned a thing he didn't want to forget. Whitman gave her a drive he knew she'd never plug in. Vaughn, on a late line, said nothing for a full breath and then said, copy, like permission and promise at once. They drove her to the strip and didn't walk past the gate. She boarded without looking back because looking back is a way to leave twice. The plane lifted into a blue that didn't care who was under it. Hayes watched it go until the dot became a guess and then a memory. On the ride home he didn't fill the truck with talk. Reed slept. Langley narrated the clouds to himself and then stopped when he realized he didn't need to. Whitman closed his eyes and replayed wind he couldn't store on any device. Bighorn waited where they had left it, the same ledge, the same scrape of antenna in gusts. On a day with bright cold and thin air, Hayes walked the perimeter alone and left a single brass round on the rock. No note. No GPS ping. Just a marker for a language not many speak. If she found it, she'd know. If she didn't, the wind would move it and that would be fine. Back in D.C., another room full of people argued doctrine and budgets and what to call a thing that doesn't need a name to work. Some said build the school. Some said don't. A quiet program somewhere else began to teach timing and restraint in small rooms without slides. It would never graduate 100 a year. It didn't need to. In the end there wasn't a statue, a medal ceremony, a speech. There was a team that learned to leave space in their head for a voice that wasn't their own. There was a captain who understood that authority doesn't have to be loud. There was a technician who learned that silence can be data. There was a young spotter who stopped shaking. There was a veteran sniper who traded bravado for patience. And there was a woman who would always choose the harder thing if it meant the right thing, to wait, to listen, to act once. People will tell the story wrong on purpose because wrong sells. They'll make the range longer, the storm darker, the city louder. They'll add flash where there wasn't any. That's fine. The right people will know. The right people always do. The lesson walks on 2 feet and doesn't need banners. Force makes noise, timing doesn't. The strongest shot is the one you don't take, and the ones you do take never need to announce themselves. North has a way of calling without sound. Somewhere under a sky that keeps its counsel, a cabin door opens, closes, and leaves no mark in the snow. A woman sits with a book that looks blank to everyone else and listens until the wind stops pretending its signal. Then, and only then, she moves.